A pregnant and injured woman decides to run away from the man who claimed to love her. The millionaire who once loved her opened his arms to help her, and a scandal was reborn. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us. Following. The dawn was thick as a living fog, and the muffled sound of the tires cutting across the road did not hide Clara's despair. At 29 years old, with her face covered in recent bruises that throbbed like open wounds in her soul, she kept her eyes fixed on the darkness, as if fleeing not only from a man, but from a part of herself that had accepted crumbs in place of love. The borrowed car creaked as she stepped on the accelerator. Each curve on the highway was a promise of distance, each kilometer a small victory against the fear that was eating away at her insides. 5 months pregnant, injured, and in shock, Clara was running from a love that had long since ceased to be a refuge and had become a prison. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, not only because of the cold of the May dawn in Brasilia, but because of the certainty that she had crossed a line of no return. David, the man she had shared the last 3 years of her life with, was now the face of fear. Violent, possessive, and financially ruined after a series of disastrous investments, he had become unpredictable, a bankrupt heir trying to control the only thing he had left, Clara. What had started as jealousy had turned into something more sinister, more dangerous. That night, after shoving her against the kitchen wall and screams that echoed through the hallways of the empty apartment, she saw the cruelest shadow form in his eyes, a promise of violence that she recognized as definitive. It was then that she fled without a cell phone, without documents, taking only a bag with some clothes and a yellowed envelope that she had kept for years like a talisman. Inside it were 2 things that seemed to come from different lives: the ultrasound of the baby growing inside her womb, and an old letter, never sent, written on a rainy night 5 years ago to a man she had pretended to forget, but who visited her dreams with disturbing regularity: Leonardo Villar. The name still caused a tightness in her chest, a mixture of desire and regret that she had never been able to fully decipher. Though a powerful businessman, owner of a chain of luxury hotels that spread throughout the country, he had been her boss for a few intense months, when Clara worked as a model in the company's advertising campaigns. A professional relationship that had become something indefinable, full of sexual tension and looks that said more than words ever could. It had been a strange time in Clara's life. Though a recent graduate in social communications, she had accepted the modeling job more out of necessity than vocation. Her natural beauty, with brown hair that rippled like ocean waves and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, had caught the agency's attention. But it was Leonardo who had insisted on keeping her in the campaigns, even when other executives suggested changes. He was different from the men Clara knew. 15 years older, he carried a seriousness that contrasted with moments of unexpected humor. Tall, with grey hair at the temples, dark eyes that seemed to see right through people, Leonardo had a presence that dominated any room. He was married at the time, but Clara felt something unspoken between them, an electric current that formed whenever they were alone. The end had come abruptly, an unresolved kiss in the office elevator, interrupted by the arrival of other employees. The next day, Leonardo had dismissed her from the campaigns with a professional coldness that contrasted with the passion of that suspended moment. A distance imposed by him, but that had never managed to erase the attraction that connected them like an invisible thread. Now, 5 years later, Clara was driving through the early hours of the morning toward the only place she felt safe to disappear: Leonardo's mansion on the shores of Lake Paranoa. She didn't even know if he still lived there, if she would still be welcomed, if he would remember her as anything more than a disposable employee. But she had no choice. Her fear of Davy was greater than her fear of rejection. The mansion's gate was illuminated by a soft light that cut through the darkness like a promise of shelter. Clara parked the borrowed car with her hands still shaking and looked at the imposing building that stretched out before her. The modern architecture contrasted with the dense vegetation that surrounded the property, creating a refuge isolated her from the world. This was where Leonardo had hidden after the divorce that had shaken the tabloids 3 years ago. She rang the doorbell as if summoning a buried past, each second of waiting weighing like an eternity. When the door opened, the past answered. Leonardo Villar, now 45, appeared in the doorway like a figure from her own nightmares and dreams. Thinner than she remembered, with an unshaven beard and disheveled hair, he stared at her like someone seeing a ghost emerging from the early morning mist. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for Clara to see recognition dawn in his dark eyes, followed by something that looked like shock, concern, and a deeper emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Leonardo's gaze shifted to the bruises on her face, then to the curve of her belly that betrayed her pregnancy, and something in his expression hardened. "Clara?" he said, and his voice held the same gravelly tone she remembered, but there was a new roughness to it, as if he had forgotten how to speak tenderly. "What happened to you?" The words came out in a rush, mixed with tears that she tried to hold back. Clara told her about Davi, about the violence that had escalated in recent weeks, about the fear that consumed her, and about having nowhere to go. She didn't mention the letter hidden in the envelope, nor what had really brought her there. Some truths had to wait. Leonardo let her in without asking any further questions. The inside of the mansion was even more impressive than Clara had imagined. High ceilings, sophisticated designer furniture, artwork on the walls, and a panoramic view of the lake that stretched out through huge windows. Everything was very clean, very organized, very empty of life. It was the home of a man who had given up on living and was simply existing. He led her to one of the guest rooms, a spacious space with a king-size bed, a private bathroom, and a balcony that overlooked the inner garden. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed the exhaustion to take over her body. Every muscle ached, every thought was a monumental effort. "You need medical attention," Leonardo said, observing her with clinical attention. "I can call my personal doctor. He can come here." Clara shook her head. "I don't want any records. I don't want anyone to know where I am." He nodded, understanding the situation without her having to explain the details. Leonardo had been through his own media scandals and knew how devastating exposure could be. Since his messy divorce and his voluntary withdrawal from the press, he had become an expert in invisibility. "How long do you need to stay?" he asked, but there was something in his intonation that suggested time was no issue. "1 night," Clara replied, though she knew 1 night wouldn't solve anything. "Just until I decide what to do." Leonardo left the room, but returned a few minutes later with a first aid kit and a cup of tea. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he tended to the cuts on her face, applying ointment and small bandages with a concentration that reminded Clara of how he used to focus on details during work meetings. His proximity awakened sensations she had thought she had buried: the smell of his skin, the temperature of his fingers, the way his eyes focused on each wound as if he were personally responsible for healing it. "Leonardo," she began, but he interrupted her. "Rest now, we'll talk tomorrow." But as he stood to leave, Clara grabbed his wrist. The touch was electric, just as it had been 5 years ago. Leonardo stopped, looking at her hand on his arm, then at her face. For a moment, time went back and they were two people trapped in an elevator again, breathing the same air thick with unresolved desire. "Thank you," she whispered. And there was so much weight in that simple word that they both knew it was about something much bigger than gratitude for shelter. Leonardo closed the bedroom door carefully, but he couldn't move away. He stood in the hallway for long minutes, leaning against the wall trying to process what had just happened. Seeing Clara there, injured and pregnant, had torn something in his chest that he thought was dead, the need to protect, to care for someone again. For 3 years since the death of his son Gabriel in a car accident that he considered his fault, Leonardo had been living in a state of emotional suspension. The divorce from Helena had been just the formalization of something that had already died long before. A marriage built on appearances and social convenience that collapsed under the weight of tragedy. Since then, he had become a spectator of his own life, moving between figures and contracts with surgical precision, but completely devoid of true human bonds. Clara's presence cut through the anesthesia, like a blade cutting through dead tissue. He remembered that time 5 years ago when she had worked on his campaigns. Clara wasn't just another pretty model. There was something in her green eyes that intrigued him, a sharp intelligence disguised as gentleness that challenged him in ways he couldn't name. At that time, Leonardo was still married, still pretending to believe that his family life could be saved. But Clara made him question everything, whether he was being honest with himself, whether what he felt for Helena was love or just habit, whether he was wasting his life on an elaborate social theater. The kiss in the elevator had been inevitable, but also impossible. That was why he had pushed her away cruelly and definitively, because he knew that if she continued to be around, he would make irreversible choices. Now she was there again, carrying a vulnerability that made him simultaneously furious and protective. Someone had hurt Clara. Someone had laid hands on her in a violent way. And this awakened in Leonardo primitive instincts that he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to find this Davi guy and make him pay for every mark on her face. Over the next few days, a strange routine settled into the mansion. Clara had asked for shelter for one night, but Leonardo offered weeks, and she accepted without much resistance. During the day, he worked in his office, participating in video conferences and managing business remotely. Clara spent hours in the library, reading, or in the garden, gazing at the lake. At night, they dined together in silence, punctuated by unspoken glances and cautious conversations that avoided dangerous topics. It was an elaborate game of approaching and retreating. Leonardo found himself watching Clara when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing how pregnancy had softened. Her features, how her brown hair shone in the natural light, how her hands unconsciously stroked her belly in protective gestures. She, in turn, felt the weight of his gaze like a physical presence, an electric current that ran through her when she least expected it. Clara was almost 6 months pregnant, and her body had changed in ways that made her insecure. She felt awkward, different, ashamed of her appearance, but Leonardo saw her as a living sculpture. Fragile, yes, but sacred. He didn't touch her, he just looked. And it was in these charged silences that the real erotic tension lived. She knew he desired her. She could feel it in the way his breathing changed when she passed by, and it lit a spark in her that had long since died. One night, Clara found a forgotten photo among the library books. It was Leonardo with a small child, a dark-haired boy with a wide smile. The resemblance between them was undeniable. When Leonardo appeared at the door, Clara held the portrait carefully as if she was afraid of breaking it. "Gabriel," he said simply, reaching out and taking the photo from her hands. "My son. He died 3 years ago." Clara felt her heart sink. There was such deep pain in his voice that she could almost touch it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and Leonardo nodded, tucking the photo into his shirt pocket. "He was 8 years old. He was in the car with me when the accident happened. I came out without a scratch. He didn't survive." Leonardo sat down in the armchair next to the bookcase, suddenly looking much older than his 45 years. "Ever since then, I've been afraid to get attached to anything, or anyone." Clara approached and, without asking permission, placed her hand over his. The touch was like an electric shock between them, but neither of them pulled away. "It wasn't your fault," she said, with a certainty that surprised them both. "How can you be sure?" "Because I know you. I know the man you are." Leonardo looked up at her, and for the first time in years, he allowed someone to see his complete vulnerability. "You don't know me, Clara, not really." "Not? Then let me know," she replied, and the simplicity of those words held a promise they both knew was too dangerous to accept. While Leonardo and Clara navigated this growing intimacy inside the mansion, the outside world began to crumble in ways neither of them could have imagined. David had not simply accepted Clara's disappearance. In the first few days after her escape, he had called everyone they knew in common, visited places she frequented, and even called acquaintances to report missing persons. But after a week of frantic searches, something changed. Davy simply disappeared. Literally. He didn't return to the apartment he shared with Clara. He didn't show up for work. He didn't give any explanations to his family or friends. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air, leaving only traces of a life abruptly cut short. The first suspicions inevitably fell on Clara. The neighbors had heard the couple's constant fighting. Friends knew of the increasing violence. When the police were unable to locate her to give a statement, speculation took on a life of its own. The press, always hungry for scandal, began to insinuate that she had fled, that a body had been hidden, or even that it was murder. It was on a Sunday morning that the house of cards began to collapse. Clara was drinking coffee on the balcony when Leonardo appeared with a tablet in his hands, a somber expression on his face. The headline of the capital's main newspaper read, "Model missing after boyfriend disappears." There was an old photo of Clara from the time she worked on the campaigns, next to a recent image of Davy taken from his social media. "How did they get this picture?" Clara asked, her hands shaking as she read the article. The text was poisonous, full of innuendo and conspiracy theories that painted Clara as a femme fatale capable of anything. "Someone leaked information," Leonardo replied, his tone controlled but filled with concern. "And there's more." He swiped the screen to show another article, this one even more alarming. An anonymous tip had been filed with the police, indicating that Clara had been seen entering Leonardo Villar's house on the same night as Davy's disappearance. The spotlight, which had faded from Leonardo after years of seclusion, was now shining on him with renewed force, rekindling his controversial fame and speculation about his personal life. Clara stood up from her chair with such force that she almost lost her balance. "I need to leave now. You can't get involved in this." But Leonardo held her arm firmly. "Where are you going to go? They'll find you anywhere. And if you run away now, you'll look even more guilty." "You don't understand," Clara said, pulling away from his touch. "They're going to destroy you too. They're going to turn your life, your company, everything upside down. I can't let that happen." Leonardo was silent for a long moment, watching the desperation on her face. Then suddenly his expression changed. There was a determination in his eyes that Clara recognized from the times when he had made difficult business decisions. "So let's control the narrative," he said. 3 hours later, the mansion was surrounded by reporters and television cameras. Leonardo had called an impromptu press conference, something he hadn't done in years. Clara watched on the television in her room, her heart beating wildly as she saw the man who had taken her in expose himself to the entire world. Leonardo appeared on the screen looking impeccable, dressed in a dark suit with his hair combed and his beard trimmed. He was once again the powerful businessman who had ruled empires. But there was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability he made no attempt to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he began, his voice echoing through the microphones, "I have called this press conference to clarify the speculations that have been circulating about my personal life and that of Clara Nascimento." Clara held her breath. "It is true that Clara is under my protection. It is true that she sought my help in a situation of extreme vulnerability. And it is true that," he paused dramatically, "that I am the father of the child she is expecting." Clara's world came crashing down. The press conference erupted into shouted questions, camera flashes going off frantically, reporters jostling for the best position. Leonardo kept talking, explaining that they had been in a secret relationship for months, that the pregnancy had been planned, that Davy was just a cover-up relationship that Clara had maintained to protect his reputation. It was all a lie, but it was a convincing lie, told with the conviction of someone who knew exactly which strings to pull in public opinion. Leonardo transformed Clara from a murder suspect into a secret lover, from a villain into a victim of an abusive relationship with a man who had discovered the betrayal and disappeared because he could not deal with the truth. When the press conference ended, Clara was in shock. Leonardo went upstairs to her room and found her sitting on the bed, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do that?" she whispered. "How could you lie like that?" "If you want a scandal," Leonardo replied, kneeling before her, "let it be for love. Leonardo's words echoed through the room like a confession neither of them were prepared to hear. Clara stared at him, trying to decipher if there was truth behind the public lie he had just created. There was something about the way he said, "for love," that made her heart race but also filled her with terror. She knew the destructive power of misdirected love. She had experienced it with David. "You don't know what you're saying," she murmured, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Love doesn't justify lies. Love doesn't justify destroying your life for someone you barely know. Leonardo stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the lake. His silhouette against the afternoon light seemed charged with a melancholy that Clara was beginning to recognize. "Do you think I don't know you?" 5 years, Clara. 5 years. Trying to forget how you touched me in those few months. 5 years pretending that kiss in the elevator meant nothing. The confession hung in the air between them, like a dangerous bridge that neither of them knew whether to cross. Clara stood up slowly, approaching him cautiously, as if he were a wounded animal that might attack or flee at any moment. "Leonardo, you are confusing protection with love, gratitude with desire. I am pregnant, wounded, vulnerable. I am not the same person I was 5 years ago." Hitsun turned to face her, and there was an intensity in his dark eyes that made her take a step back. "Do you think I care about those things? That I care if you're pregnant with another man's child? That I care if you came here hurt?" His voice grew lower, huskier. "You don't understand, Clara. I want you, all of you, including the scars." The statement was like a punch to the gut. Clara felt her legs go weak, not from weakness, but from a desire she had been trying to suppress since arriving at the mansion. For days she had felt his gaze, the tension building between them, the way the air felt charged whenever they were alone. But admitting it would be too dangerous. "No," she said, shaking her head. "We can't. This is crazy. You just put me in an impossible situation. You just lied to the entire world, and now you want me to—" "That you what?" he asked, stepping closer. "That you admit that you feel the same way I do? That you think about us too when you're alone in your room at night?" Clara stepped back until her back touched the wall. Leonardo stopped a few inches away from her, close enough for her to feel the heat of his body, the scent of his skin, the intensity of his breathing. It was exactly like 5 years ago in the elevator, when the world had stopped for a few eternal seconds. "I can't," she whispered, but her voice sounded less convincing with each word. "I can't be involved with you like that, not now, not like this." "Why not?" "Because I'm leaving. Because this will pass. Because you'll get tired of playing hero, and I'll get tired of being saved." Leonardo raised his hand, lightly touching, her face avoiding the bruises that were still healing. "What if I don't get tired? What if you don't leave?" Clara closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the texture of his skin for a few precious seconds. "Then we're both going to get hurt. Because that's what happens when broken people try to fix each other." He withdrew his hand, but did not walk away. "Maybe," he said, "maybe it's better to hurt yourself trying than to die of loneliness pretending to be whole." That night, the tension in the mansion was palpable. They ate dinner in silence, each lost in thoughts they dared not share. Clara retired early but could not sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house, Leonardo's footsteps in the hallway, the door to her room closing, then opening again. Around 2 in the morning, a storm hit Brasilia with unusual force. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the windows, and rain pounded against the glass like desperate fists. That's when the power went out, plunging the mansion into complete darkness. Clara left the room, trying to find her way in the darkness. Her hands were groping the walls for useless switches when she bumped into something solid and warm. Leonardo was there, in the hallway, looking for her in the darkness. "Clara," he whispered, "I am here." They stood there, breathing heavily, unable to see each other but feeling each other's presence with an intensity that the light had never provided. In the darkness, the barriers seemed less solid, the reasons less convincing. It was Clara who moved first, raising her hand until it found his face. Leonardo took her hand, kissing her palm with a tenderness that made her tremble. Then it was he who pulled her closer, until their bodies touched, until she could feel his heart beating against hers. "Clara," he whispered her name like a prayer, And then, without any more words, without any more resistance, they kissed in the darkness. The kiss in the darkness was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical desire, but a merging of wounded souls recognizing each other. Leonardo's hands trembled as they touched her face, as if she were made of crystal and could shatter at any moment. Clara gave herself completely, allowing years of restraint to dissolve in that dark hallway. They moved without speaking, guided only by touch and mutual need. Leonardo led her to his room, his steps cautious in the darkness. When he closed the door behind them, the sound echoed like a simultaneous promise and doom. The moonlight filtered through the storm clouds, created dancing shadows in the room. Clara could see only the outline of Leonardo, but she felt his presence with an intensity that made her dizzy. He approached slowly, giving her time to step back, to say no, to break the dangerous spell that had enveloped them. But Clara didn't back away. Instead, she lifted her hands to his chest, feeling the tense muscles beneath his shirt, the rapid rhythm of his breathing. "Are you sure?" she whispered, because she needed to hear it, needed to know that she wasn't alone in this madness. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," he replied, his voice husky with restrained desire. What happened between them was a meeting of wounded bodies seeking healing in each other. Leonardo touched Clara as if she were sacred, carefully avoiding the areas where the bruises were still tender, kissing each scar as if he could erase the pain with only tenderness. Clara in turn explored his body with a hunger that surprised her, her hands mapping muscles, scars, the texture of his skin, as if trying to memorize every detail. When they finally came together, it was with tears in their eyes. Tears of relief, of pleasure, of a connection that transcended the physical. Leonardo whispered her name like a prayer, and Clara lost herself in the feeling of being complete for the first time in years. They made love with the intensity of someone who knew that that moment could be unique, unrepeatable, forbidden. Afterwards, they lay cuddled together in bed, Clara nestled against Leonardo's chest, listening to his heartbeat return to normal. The storm outside was beginning to calm down, but inside the room, a new storm was just beginning. "What did we do?" Clara murmured against his skin. "We're done pretending," Leonardo replied, kissing the top of her head. But the next day, reality came back with brutal force. Leonardo woke up alone. Clara had returned to her room before dawn. During breakfast, they barely looked at each other, the weight of what had happened hanging between them like a silent accusation. It was Leonardo who broke the silence first. "Clara, about last night." "It was a mistake," she interrupted, keeping her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. "We're both vulnerable, confused. It doesn't mean anything." The words hit Leonardo like knives. He knew about defense mechanisms. He had used them after his son's death and the divorce. "You don't believe this," he said. "I have to believe it," Clara replied, finally looking at him. "Because if that meant anything, then I'm fucked, because I can't fall in love with you, Leonardo. I can't allow myself to." "Why not?" "Because every time I fall in love, I destroy myself. Because I choose men who hurt me. Because I'm afraid you're just like the others, only more sophisticated." Leonardo got up from the table, walking towards her. "I'm not David, Clara." "No," she agreed. "You're worse. Because with David, I knew I was being hurt. With you, I'll hurt myself, creating expectations, dreaming of impossibilities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an envelope delivered by a motorcyclist. Leonardo opened it, and his expression changed completely. It was a handwritten letter in elegant, feminine handwriting. "What is it?" Clara asked, noticing the tension on his face. "It's from a woman named Donna Estella. She says she was my family's housekeeper for decades, that she knows you and that she has important information about Davy's disappearance." Clara felt her blood run cold. What kind of information? Leonardo continued reading. "She says she helped you on the road the night you ran away, that she saw you crying, offered to help, but you refused, and that—" He stopped, frowning. "What else?" She suggests you look for Davi at my family's beach house in Buzios. She says there are things there you need to see to understand what really happened. Clara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. That doesn't make sense. Why would David be at your beach house? How does this woman know where he is? I don't know, Leonardo admitted, but I think we need to find out. No, Clara said, shaking her head vigorously. I need to find out, alone. You've done too much for me already, exposed yourself too much. I won't drag you deeper into this mess. But Leonardo grabbed her arm as she tried to leave the kitchen. We're going together, Clara. After what happened last night, after what I said at the press conference, we're in this together, whether you like it or not. Clara stared at him for a long moment, seeing the determination in his eyes. She knew that arguing would be pointless, and secretly, she felt relieved that she wouldn't have to face the ghosts of her past alone. The drive to Buzios was tense and silent. Clara looked out the car window, watching the landscape of Rio de Janeiro change as they approached the coast, but her mind was elsewhere. The words from Donna Estella's letter echoed in her head like an omen. How did that woman know about Davi? Why had she specifically mentioned the villa's beach house? Leonardo drove with concentration, his hands tense on the steering wheel. Every now and then he cast worried glances at Clara, noticing how she unconsciously stroked her belly in protective gestures. The pregnancy was more evident now, at 6 months, and this made him feel even more responsible for protecting her from any dangerous situation they might encounter. The Villar beach house was located in a secluded area of Buzios, far from the busy beaches and tourist hotels. It was an imposing property, built on the rocks with panoramic views of the ocean. Leonardo had not been there for more than 2 years, since before Gabriel died. The place held too many memories, family summers that now seemed to belong to another life. When they arrived, they found the main gate locked, but Clara noticed that one of the side windows was ajar. "Someone's been here recently," she murmured, pointing to the footprints in the sand that led to the side entrance. Leonardo took the spare keys he kept in a secret compartment and opened the house. The smell of the sea mixed with something vaguely putrid hit them as soon as they entered. The house was in darkness, the furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts from an abandoned past. It was then that they heard a faint moan coming from upstairs. Clara and Leonardo looked at each other, fear spreading between them like a stain. They climbed the stairs slowly, Leonardo leading the way, trying to shield Clara from anything they might encounter. The moaning sound came again, more clearly now, coming from one of the back rooms. The door was ajar. Leonardo pushed it open completely, and what they saw left them in shock. David was there, alive but clearly weakened, tied to a chair with ropes that had left marks on his wrists. Thin, bearded, with eyes wide with fear, he stared at Clara as if she were a hallucination. "Clara?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. You came to save me?" Clara froze. All the emotions she felt for David, fear, anger, disgust, mixed together into utter confusion. "What are you doing here? Who brought you?" "His bodyguards," David said, jerking his chin in Leonardo's direction. "They caught me. The night you ran away. They said it was to protect their boss's reputation, that I was a problem that needed to go away." Leonardo was livid. "That's a lie. I never ordered any of this. My security guards wouldn't do this without my authorization." "No?" A female voice sounded behind them. Clara and Leonardo turned to find an elegant woman at the entrance to the room. Helena Villar, Leonardo's ex-wife, stood there with a cold smile on her lips. "Maybe you don't know your employees as well as you think, dear." "Helena," Leonardo said, his voice thick with surprise and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" "Protecting my interests," she replied, striding into the room with the confidence of someone in control. "Did you really think I was going to let you play hero with your pregnant girlfriend without consequences?" Clara felt the world spinning around her. You were the one who ordered Davy's kidnapping?" "Kidnapping is too strong a word," Helena said dismissively. "I'd say it was more of a temporary detention. We needed someone to blame for his disappearance, and you would be perfect for the role. A violent, desperate woman. Pregnant. by another man. The story would write itself. "You're crazy," Leonardo said, positioning himself between Helena and Clara. "That's a crime, Helena. You can go to jail for this." Helena laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the walls of the empty house. "Me? Honey, all the evidence points to you. Your security, your home, your orders. I'm just a worried ex-wife who discovered her ex-husband's criminal activities." It was then that Clara understood the extent of the trap. Helena had orchestrated everything: Davy's kidnapping, the leaking of information to the press, even Donna Estella's letter, all to compromise Leonardo and destroy any chance of happiness he might have had. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with anger. "Why do this? You're already divorced, you already have your share of the assets. Why destroy his life?" Helena stared at Clara with pure hatred. "Because he never loved me. In 15 years of marriage, he has never looked at me the way he looks at you. And if he can't be mine, he won't be anyone else's." At that moment, Clara felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. The tension, the shock of the discovery, everything was affecting her body in ways she couldn't control. She doubled over, holding her stomach. "Clara!" Leonardo knelt beside her, panic in his voice. "What's going on?" I think it's the baby," she moaned, feeling another, stronger contraction. Helena watched the scene with cruel satisfaction. How convenient. It seems our little family reunion is going to have an even more dramatic ending than I planned. But before anyone could react, sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching the house. Helena lost her composure for a moment, running to the window. "How?" she murmured. Leonardo smiled even as he helped Clara to her feet. "You forgot that I didn't get to where I am by being naive, Helena. Before I left Brasilia, I called my lawyer and left clear instructions about where we would be. If something happened to us, the police would know exactly where to look." The sirens grew louder, and Clara could see the blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of the house. But her main concern was no longer Helena or even David. The contractions were getting stronger and more frequent. "Leonardo," she whispered, clutching his shirt, "I think the baby is coming." The chaos that followed was like a slow-motion action sequence. Police burst into the house to find Helena trying to escape through the back, Davy tied up and in shock, and Clara in premature labor in Leonardo's arms. The paramedics who were monitoring the operation immediately took control of the medical situation, while investigators began to unravel the web of lies and manipulation that Helena had woven. At the hospital, as Clara was rushed to the delivery room, Leonardo faced hours of interrogation. The truth slowly began to emerge. Helena had used contacts from her time with Leonardo to hire private security guards who operated outside the official agency. She had orchestrated Davy's kidnapping not only out of jealousy, but also as part of an elaborate plan to frame Leonardo and get the divorce settlement revised. The evidence against Helena was piling up: recorded conversations with security guards, suspicious bank transfers, even the confession of Donna Estella, who revealed that she had been coerced into writing the letter that led Clara and Leonardo to Buzios. Leonardo's ex-wife had underestimated the power of the truth when faced with a serious investigation. But for Leonardo, none of that mattered at that moment. His only concern was Clara and the baby. The premature birth at 7 months created risks that left him in a panic. He spent the night pacing the hospital corridors, unable to concentrate on anything other than the medical updates that arrived every hour. It was at 5 in the morning that a doctor finally arrived with news. Clara had given birth to twins, a surprise no one had expected, since one of the babies had been hidden behind the other in previous ultrasounds. A boy and a girl, both small but breathing on their own, both fighters like their mother. "She wants to see you," the doctor told Leonardo, "but I need to warn you, she is very fragile, physically and emotionally. What happened in Buzios, combined with the premature birth, was traumatic." Leonardo entered the room with his heart in his throat. Clara was pale, exhausted, but her eyes shone with a light he had never seen before, the light of a mother. She held the 2 babies, one in each arm, tiny but perfect. "They're fine," she whispered when she saw him. The doctors said they'll need to stay in the NICU for a few weeks, but they're fine. Leonardo approached the bed, looking at the children with an emotion he couldn't name. They're beautiful, he said, his voice breaking. Leonardo, Clara said, and there was something solemn in her tone. I need to tell you something about their father. He sat down in the chair next to the bed, preparing himself to hear a truth he might not want to know. Clara took a deep breath before continuing. 6 years ago I had artificial insemination. I was single, I wanted to be a mother, and I decided to do it myself. The donor was anonymous. I only knew some basic characteristics. She paused, looking at the babies. When the doctors did the routine checks after the birth, they discovered something. They asked for an emergency DNA test because one of the babies had a rare heart condition that is hereditary. Leonardo felt the world stop. Clara, the donor was you, Leonardo. You had donated sperm to the same bank years before, when you were trying to have children with Helena, and she couldn't get pregnant. The doctors showed me the records. These children are biologically yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Leonardo looked at the babies with renewed intensity, searching for similarities, familiar features. And they were there. The shape of the boy's eyes, the curve of the girl's lips, small details that now made sense. That's why you kept my letter, he said, finally understanding. That's why you came looking for me that night. Clara nodded. I wasn't sure, it was just a suspicion, but when I saw you at that press conference assuming paternity for them, it was like the universe was trying to tell us something. Leonardo reached out, gently touching each baby's face. What are we going to name them? I thought of Gabriel, Clara said softly. For the boy, if you don't mind, and Sophia for the girl. The tears that Leonardo had been holding back finally overflowed. Gabriel, like the son he had lost. It was as if life was giving him a second chance, an opportunity to be a father again, to love without fear. Clara, he said, taking her free. And I know this is all complicated, confusing. I know you're afraid to get involved with me, to trust any man after what you went through with David. But these babies, they brought us back to each other for a reason. Clara looked at him with teary eyes. What if it doesn't work out? What if we get hurt? What if you get tired of playing family? Then at least we will have tried, Leonardo replied, echoing the words he had said weeks earlier at the mansion. At least we will have been honest about how we feel. In that hospital room, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the soft sound of medical monitors, Clara made the scariest and bravest decision of her life. Okay, she whispered. Let's try. The months that followed were a roller coaster of emotions, discoveries, and growth. Helena was convicted of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy, receiving an 8-year prison sentence. Davi, traumatized by the experience but physically recovered, moved to the interior of Minas Gerais, where his family helped him rebuild his life away from the spotlight and painful memories. Clara spent 6 weeks in the hospital with the twins in the neonatal intensive care unit. Gabriel and Sophia, little warriors, surpassed all medical expectations. The boy recovered completely from his heart condition after a delicate surgery, and Sophia showed from an early age a strong personality that was very reminiscent of her mother. Leonardo practically lived in the hospital during this time. Every day he arrived with fresh flowers for Clara, books to read during the long hours of waiting, and infinite patience to listen to her worries, fears, and hopes. He learned how to change diapers, give bottles, and rock the babies to sleep. He was discovering fatherhood in a completely different way than the first time, with full awareness of each precious moment. When they were finally discharged from the hospital, Leonardo suggested that Clara and the babies move into the mansion. Temporarily, he said, until you decide what you want to do with your life. But they both knew it was more than that. It was an attempt to build something real and lasting. The adjustment was not easy. Clara, accustomed to independence, struggled with the feeling of being supported. Leonardo, accustomed to solitude, had to learn to share space, time, and attention. There were days of tension, arguments about how to raise the babies, moments when they seemed like two strangers trying to force an intimacy that perhaps did not exist. It was during one of these crises that Clara made a decision that would change everything. Locked in the mansion's office while Leonardo took care of the twins, she began to write, not a diary or letters, but a real story. Her story. The narrative of a woman who found strength in fragility, love in destruction, rebirth in pain. The book, published under the pseudonym C. Nascimento, was called While I Waited. It was raw, honest, painful, and at the same time full of hope. Clara wrote about domestic violence without romanticizing it, about motherhood without idealizing it, about love without making it perfect. It was the story of a real woman facing real problems. The success was immediate and unexpected. The book touched women of all ages, especially those who had been through similar situations. Clara began to receive letters, emails, and messages from readers who identified with her journey. Publishers competed for the translation rights, and production companies wanted to adapt the story for film and television. Leonardo watched Clara's success with a mixture of pride and admiration. He saw how she blossomed when she talked about the book, how she gained confidence with each interview, each literary event. She was becoming the woman she had always been inside, but whom adverse circumstances had hidden. "You don't need me anymore," he said one night after Clara returned from a launch event in Sao Paulo. The twins were asleep in their room. The house was quiet, and they found themselves on the balcony looking out at the lake. Clara looked at him in surprise. "Why are you saying that?" "Because it's true. You have your career, your money, your independence. You can raise the twins alone if you want. You don't have to stay here out of gratitude or convenience." "Is that what you think?" Clara asked, a hint of irritation in her voice. "That I'm here out of gratitude?" Leonardo sighed. "I don't know what to think anymore, Clara. Sometimes it feels like we're a real family. Other times it feels like we're just pretending, playing roles we don't know if we want to live." Clara was silent for a long moment, watching the city lights, reflected in the lake water. "Do you know what I feared most when I decided to try this relationship?" she finally said. "What?" "That you would give up at the first sign of difficulty. That when things got complicated, when I was no longer the fragile victim who needed to be saved, you would lose interest." Leonardo turned to face her. "Clara, Let me finish," she interrupted him. "I was right to be afraid, because that's exactly what's happening. Now that I have my own strength, now that I don't need saving, you don't know what your role in my life is anymore." Clara's words hit Leonardo like a punch. She was right, and he hated to admit it. He had grown accustomed to being the protector, the provider, the hero of the story. He didn't know how to simply be a companion. "Then teach me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Teach me how to love a strong woman." Clara smiled for the first time that night, starting by stopping thinking you need to save me. "I don't want a savior, Leonardo. I want a partner." 2 years later, life had found a rhythm that neither of them had imagined possible. Clara was at the height of her literary career, with 3 books published and a foundation that helped women who were victims of domestic violence. Gabriel and Sophia, now 2.5 years old, ran around the mansion that had become their home, their laughter echoing through the hallways that had previously been filled with silence and solitude. Leonardo had learned to be a partner without being a savior. He took care of the twins when Clara was away on business. He took part in decisions about their education. He shared the household responsibilities without anyone having to ask. Most importantly, he had learned to admire Clara's strength without feeling diminished by it. They still lived in the mansion, but now it reflected a real family. Toys scattered around the living room, drawings of the children taped to the refrigerator, smiling photos on the walls. Clara had insisted on renovating the room that had belonged to the first Gabriel, turning it into the office where she worked. "He would be part of our story anyway," she told Leonardo. "Better with love than with pain." The Villar Nascimento Foundation had become a national reference in providing support to women in vulnerable situations. Clara and Leonardo worked together on the project, each contributing their skills. She with her personal experience and sensitivity in dealing with victims, and he with the resources and business knowledge to make the institution grow in a sustainable way. For one Saturday morning, as he watched Clara play with the twins in the garden, Leonardo made a decision that had been brewing for months. It would not be a traditional marriage proposal. They had built something much more solid than contracts or ceremonies. It would be a declaration of permanence, an acknowledgement that they had chosen each other every day, in every difficulty overcome, in every joy shared. That night, after the children were asleep, Leonardo asked Clara to accompany him to her office. On the desk was a sealed envelope with her name handwritten on it. "Another letter?" she asked, smiling. Since the beginning of their relationship, they had maintained the habit of writing letters to each other, a tradition that had begun years before and had become the most intimate form of communication between them. "The most important one I've ever written," Leonardo replied. Clara opened the envelope carefully. The letter was written in Leonardo's elegant handwriting, but there was something different about it, a vulnerability that showed even in the way he held the pen. "My dear Clara," she began to read aloud, "when you arrived at my door that morning, I thought I was saving you. I didn't know it was you who would come to save me. You arrived wounded, but it was you who healed me. You bled, and yet you made me reborn. During these 2 years, I learned that love is not about perfection or about fixing people. It's about choosing to stay even when it's hard. It's about growing together, about building something new from the broken pieces left over from our previous lives." Clara stopped reading, her eyes filled with tears. Leonardo approached, continuing the words from memory. "This love we have is not perfect. We have scars, fears, bad days, silly arguments about how to discipline the twins or where to spend the holidays. But it's all I have that's true. It's the only love I've ever experienced without masks, without lies, without trying to be someone I'm not." He took her hands in his, intertwining their fingers. "Clara Nascimento, do you want to spend the rest of your life building this beautiful mess with me? Do you want to be my wife, not because you need to be saved, but because you choose to be loved?" Clara's answer came through a mixture of tears and laughter, a whispered yes that carried all, the weight of the journey that had brought them here. They kissed in the moonlit study, surrounded by the books Clara had written and the memories they had made together. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony at the mansion itself, overlooking the lake. Gabriel and Sophia were page boys, scattering rose petals along the way. The only people present were close friends and the foundation staff who had become family. Donna Estela, the real housekeeper that Helena had used in her plans, served as Clara's godmother, a symbolic way of showing that not all ghosts from the past were hauntings. Late in the evening, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Clara and Leonardo met again on the balcony, where so many important conversations had taken place. She was still wearing her simple wedding dress. He had loosened his tie. They were now officially husband and wife, but that changed little in the essence of what they already were. "I can't believe we did it," Clara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We achieved what?" "This. Us. A real family, built from so much chaos." Leonardo kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair that still made him dizzy after all these years. "You know what I think?" he said. "What?" "I think chaos was necessary. Without it, we wouldn't have learned to value peace. Without pain, we wouldn't recognize joy. Without being broken, we wouldn't know how good it is to be whole." Clara smiled, watching the city lights reflect off the calm lake. Inside the house, she could hear the soft sounds of Gabriel and Sophia sleeping, the quiet breathing of children, growing up safe and loved. It was the sound of the life they had built together, note by note, day by day, choice by choice. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was true, and that, they discovered, was more than enough.